There's something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear.
That the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
George Bernard Shaw once wrote, "Some people see things as they are and say, why? I dream things that never were and say, why not?"
There is nothing wrong with America that cannot be cured by what is right with America.
Change will not come if we wait for some other person or if we wait for some other time. We are the ones we've been waiting for.
The Patriotic Progressive, for truth, justice, and the democratic way. And now your host, Stephen Hanks.
Well, folks, that last speaker in my opening run of famous, iconic speeches by Democrats and progressive leaders was Barack Obama. And we are going to hear his incredible speaking again this coming week. I think he is going to be speaking on Tuesday at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Good morning to all of you out there in Sedona and throughout the Verde Valley listening right now on this August 17th, 2024 through KAZM 106.5 FM and 780 AM Mellow Mountain Radio. Like the man said, my name is Stephen Hanks, and this radio show, which is heard every Saturday morning at 8 a.m., is called The Patriotic Progressive, for truth, justice, and the democratic way. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, progressives can be and are patriots. And I also want to welcome folks from all over Arizona and around the country who may be tuning into the live stream on mellowmountainradio.com, and anyone who is listening to the podcast version on Apple or Amazon Podcast, YouTube, or Spotify. So, folks, this week's episode of the Patriotic Progressive is basically part two of a conversation we started last week, focusing on the growing threat of Christian nationalism in this country, and that was through the recently released documentary, Bad Faith, Christian Nationalism's Unholy War on Democracy. And my guest this morning is New York Times bestselling author Andra Watkins, who is also sounding the alarm about Christian nationalism on her terrific Substack newsletter. I'm going to introduce you to Andra and talk all about her work in a few minutes. But first, as always, I must spend a few minutes commenting on the week that was in the 2024 presidential race. And again, I have to start out by saying, where the heck do I begin? There is so much news coming out of the presidential campaigns these days. It's even more than the 24/7 cable news cycle can handle. Since our show last Saturday morning was just a few hours about what became a huge Harris Walls rally in Glendale, Arizona. I guess I'll start there. Anybody out there who has seen the videos or even attended the rallies for the Democratic ticket over the past couple of weeks and doesn't realize this momentum and excitement isn't leading to Kamala Harris becoming the next president of the United States just is not savvy about politics. And I'm saying that before this week's Democratic National Convention in Chicago, which will just accelerate the momentum even more and lead to another significant bump for the Harris-Walz ticket in all of the polls. And once Kamala and the coach demolish the sociopath and his mini-me VP pick in their respective debates, this race will effectively be over. And that's not even including the complete self-destruction and political malpractice the Republican ticket exhibits with every comment out of their addled brains, like the one that Donald Trump recently made, comparing the Presidential Medal of Freedom Award to to the Medal of Honor for heroes in battle in the military. Just a statement that was beyond the pale and should be disqualifying, but of course, with Donald Trump, it won't be. You know, it's almost as if Trump and Vance are trying to top each other in a game of who can make the stupidest and most offensive statement in public. At the risk of being supremely overconfident, which I know can be the kiss of death for Democrats, I'm predicting right now that by the height of the early voting period and then Election Day, the Democrats will have so many electoral college paths to 270 electoral votes, the Democrats might be able to lose a swing state, say like Georgia, where they're performing massive voter suppression that always goes on in that state with that governor. I wouldn't be surprised if Kamala and the coach win North Carolina, and they even have a shot at Ohio. And Florida and Texas, believe it or not, could be very close because the Democratic Senate candidates in those states could upset Rick Scott and Ted Cruz, the two awful incumbents there. Two of the more reprehensible insurrectionist election deniers in the Congress. Now, before I introduce my special guest, I want to say a few things to anybody listening right now or might listen to the podcast who identifies as a Trump Republican or a maggot or even someone who leans independent but still hasn't ruled out voting for Donald Trump. And my Democratic and progressive listeners have permission to use the following if they can still talk to their Trumpy friends or relatives. So here's my message. What the hell is wrong with you people? When are you going to stop supporting a pathological lying sociopath who is a criminal and a bully and a racist and insults our military veterans, and on top of that is ignorant, intellectually bankrupt, and is likely experiencing the first stages of dementia? Do you people identify so much with a man totally devoid of morals, ethics, and any semblance of character that you will vote for him no matter what? Is this the person you want your children and grandchildren growing up seeing in the White House for the next 4 years? And if so, I ask, why? Because of immigrants, abortion, and taxes? Excuse me. I'm just getting over a bout of COVID a couple weeks ago. Because you can't bear the idea that in 10 to 15 years or so, white people will be the minority race in this country? Because you believe that Christianity should be the national religion and your religious beliefs should dictate every aspect of American society? And to the Trump women out there, do you support him because you are fine with a serial sexual abuser and an adjudicated rapist leading this country, as long as he makes sure women like you are back in the kitchen and having babies? While he supports banning books and destroying public education? I'm begging you, if you can't bring yourself to vote for a Democrat, stay the heck home on Election Day. And one last thing, and this is for anyone listening, whether Democrat, Republican, Independent, Libertarian, or would-be authoritarian. I want to read a quote from Brian Taylor Cohen from his new book, Shameless, that I found the other day, posted on social media. So here it is. Americans have become bizarrely complicit in allowing different standards for Democrats and Republicans. Mark Elias, the great election defender of election rights and voting rights in this country, spoke to this nonsensical, unconstitutional division. And this is a quote from Mark Elias. I recoil at the arguments we so often hear. People will say, well, Democrats need to win by enough that Donald Trump can't even contest the election. What kind of election system is it when one candidate gets to win by a little, whereas the other has to win by a lot? Or people say, we can't have the disqualification of Donald Trump because people will threaten another January 6th. What kind of system is that? You can't have a political system where one side has to be the adults and the other does not. I think that's just about says it all. And so now that I've gotten that out of my system, I'll introduce my guest who is patiently waiting for me to finish my little rant. As I mentioned earlier, Andra Watkins, who is on the phone with us this morning from Charleston, South Carolina, a state I wish Democrats had a chance of winning, but we're going to win the neighboring state just north of that. Andra is a National Book Award nominee and New York Times bestselling author of the memoir, Not Without My Father, One Woman's 444-Mile Walk of the Natchez Trace. But Andra came to my attention, and thousands of others, for her Substack newsletter, How Project 2025 Will Ruin Your Life, which she has posted regularly since early this year, and is basically a primer detailing every way that draconian right-wing manifesto is a danger to this country if Donald Trump gets elected, and perhaps even if he doesn't. I'd like to read Andra's About message on her Substack page, as it tells you about her and her writings as well as or better than any personal bio can. And I'm quoting Andra on her Substack. I'm a New York Times bestselling author, but I'm not on Substack to beg for book sales and notoriety. I spent my formative years in a moral majority era Christian Nationalist church and school in rural South Carolina. I was indoctrinated in the very belief system people like Ron DeSantis, Greg Abbott, Mike Johnson, and Marjorie Taylor Greene want to force upon all Americans. I escaped that world more than 20 years ago, but indoctrination always lives in the brain. And a lot of Fox News viewers can probably attest to that. I'm applying my deep understanding of how Christian nationalists think to their Christo-fascist manifesto, Project 2025. Mainstream media outlets miss Project 2025's biblical language and imagery. They speed bump over the radicalized religious fanaticism of this document and its framers. Post by post, I'm spelling it all out. Together, I hope we can convince enough Americans to vote against this Christo-fascist scourge and choose freedom and democracy this November, unquote. Well, Andra, I have to say I second that emotion, and I welcome you to the Patriotic Progressive.
Thanks for having me, Stephen. It's good to be here.
It's great having you. I've just been so impressed with your Substack and all the essays about Project 2025. Before we dive into your massive analysis of Project 2025, let's touch on Christian nationalism a bit, following up on my show from last week. I mentioned to Steve Ulaki, the director of Bad Faith, that back in September 2016, less than 2 months before the presidential election, I wrote an essay for a website saying that even after Hillary Clinton won the election, which a lot of people were confident would happen, that even if she won, by observing the Trump campaign, his racist rhetoric, and the people around him, was that we would all have to worry about the rise of white supremacy in this country. And while the kind of white supremacists who rampaged the Congress on January 6th still deeply trouble me, as a lot of people, now I'm greatly concerned about what may be a more insidious and dangerous movement that has been building for decades and will remain a threat to our democracy after Kamala Harris becomes president. And that is Christian nationalism. So that's my long-winded way of asking you, do you think white supremacy and Christian nationalism are joined at the hip? Is one more dangerous than the other? Is one an outgrowth of the other? How do you see those two movements playing out in the country?
Well, on my Substack, I have an entry that talks about the 7 different beliefs of Christian nationalists as I was indoctrinated in Christian nationalism. And the 5th belief is this notion that we're not just a white Christian nation, but white people are superior. And they draw that thought system from the story of Noah in the Bible. That is the story that they used during the lead up to the Civil War to justify enslaving black people in the South. So when the South lost the Civil War, a lot of these Southern pastors didn't stop preaching that doctrine, including the pastor in the church I grew up in the 70s and 80s, that black people were cursed by God, or colored peoples were cursed by God because of that story in the Bible. So I feel like white supremacists and Christian nationalists are very comfortable together because many Christian nationalists are white supremacists.
Right.
They subscribe to that notion that they are a superior race because the Bible says they are. So, you know, even though I don't believe that, obviously, but a lot of people in the South particularly have grown up hearing that in pulpits since they were small, and it is very much a part of the culture as a result of that.
Right. Yeah, you know, you started touching on your background, and that was actually the next question I wanted to ask you and have you talk about. Is it seems like, you know, from what you talk about in your Substack, that you're kind of an escapee of Christian nationalism, sort of like people who get out of those other religious cults like Scientology, et cetera. Can you talk a bit about your personal experiences and how you got out of it?
Well, I didn't choose to go into it. My parents enrolled me in a Christian nationalist Christian school that was attached to a church for kindergarten. And that was very common in the South in the 1970s. Churches started these schools to avoid putting your children in public schools with black people.
Right, right.
So you know, my parents also didn't want me to be taught evolution in school and things like that. So I grew up in a school where we used creationist textbooks. The history textbooks and science textbooks were largely published by an arm of Bob Jones University in Greenville, South Carolina. So, you know, for the first 20 or so years of my life, even into my 20s, I was still very attached to that indoctrination that I grew up with because I didn't have any other choice.
Mm-hmm. And this was in South Carolina?
I lived in South Carolina. I've lived in South Carolina most of my life.
Yeah.
I still do when I'm here.
Right.
So, you know, and part of that indoctrination system is this notion of gaslighting, which we see the Republican Party doing to the country now. You know, they're very good at gaslighting, but they keep you in line. I mean, my mother is a narcissist, so she would gaslight me to control me, but also the church pastors and whatnot would do the same thing. So it took me into my early 30s to have an incident with someone in my life that caused me to start questioning some of that upbringing. And so I started with history. I started reading history books, autobiographies and biographies and whatnot about the founding of our country. And what I read was very different than what I was taught, which was the Christian nationalist. America was founded as a Christian nation. It was founded as a white Christian nation because the people who came here from Europe were all trying to have religious freedom, and they were all white people. And, you know, the Bible is God's inspired word of God, and it's 100% true, and we interpret it literally, and our law should be drawn from that. I mean, that's how I was brought up, and that's the history that I was taught. So to read these books about Enlightenment era founders, many of whom weren't Christians, as I was taught, and how the Constitution was an Enlightenment era document, was something I'd never heard before. And so it really rocked my world and made me more curious to learn more. And I was still having a really bad time with the person that I'd fallen out with in that world. And so it took me about 10 years of reading and study on multiple fronts. I had no art education. My science education was all creationist education. To deprogram enough of that to realize just how backward and wrong how I grew up was. But it started with an argument with someone in my life and spiraled from there. That's how I got out of it. And it's not an easy thing to just say to people, well, you should just leave that. It's such an all-encompassing part of your life. I don't call the church that I grew up in a cult, but they do use cult-like tactics to keep you attached to it. Your whole life revolves around it. Everybody in your life is part of that world. So I don't have really any relationship with anybody from that time in my life because I chose to leave that. So I don't get invited to my reunions, for example.
Yeah, wow.
From the Christian school, so not that I mind, but, when you start trying to leave a world like that, there are mechanisms in place to try to pull you back in.
Yeah, and
when those things start activating, a lot of people give up.
Well, given what you just said and what you just explained, and I appreciate you telling us that story, it has got to be, I know it would be for me, it has got to be incredibly frustrating and agonizing. And this may be the reason, you can tell me the reason why you're doing the Substack essay series. It's got to be one of the reasons why you're doing it, because watching what is happening again with Christian nationalism and the way states want to indoctrinate children again, the banning of books, the putting the 10 Commandments up in classrooms, the laws that they want to pass, the history that they want to negate, that is anything other than Christian teachings. I mean, it's got to be driving you crazy.
I have to say it's very triggering. That's part of the reason I spend part of my life in Spain, living in northern Spain.
Yeah.
Because when Mike Johnson was elected Speaker of the House, for example, I was in the U.S., and I had a meltdown for about 2 weeks.
Oh, boy.
And my husband looked at me and said, you just need to go back to Spain. Because looking at him, I mean, he is every smug, sanctimonious, white church man that I grew up having to look at. And it is very triggering to say, I've done all this work on myself. I got away from that. I didn't have to think about that anymore, except when I encountered my family members who still do that.
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden I could be forced to live like that again.
Boy.
And it's very upsetting for me, obviously. So when I picked up Project 2025, it was not long after he was elected speaker, and started reading it and saw all the biblical references in it that I learned as a kid. I was just like, this is terrible. And nobody's talking about it that way. At the time, nobody was.
Yeah. It's funny that you mentioned going to Spain. If Trump gets elected, my go-to place is going to be Amsterdam. I just want to let you know. So I have my passport ready, but I don't think I'm going to have to use it. So since you brought it up, let's talk about your amazing Substack essays on Project 2025, which at this point I think could be compiled into a substantial book by itself. So let me tell my audience some of the background of this. In April 2023, the Heritage Foundation published this 920-page Mandate for Leadership, The Conservative Promise. That was the title, which is otherwise known as Project 2025, the Presidential Transition Project. It was written by hundreds of conservatives, most prominently former Trump administration officials. Nearly half of the project's collaborating organizations have received dark money contributions from a network of fundraising groups linked to Leonard Leo, the major conservative donor and key figure in guiding the selection of Trump's federal judicial appointments. Basically, the guy from the Heritage Foundation who gave Donald Trump the little slip of paper with the 3 conservative justices' names on it, who Donald Trump probably didn't know from Adam and just did what the Heritage Foundation told him to do. Anyway, I digress. You started your Substack series, I believe, at the end of January, and in that first essay you said, we aim to educate Americans about Project 2025 by framing it differently. How will each objective impact your life, your families, your jobs, your communities? So what triggered your motivation to actually launch this particular project on Substack?
It was a combination of things. I had been approached to do a book proposal in 2023 by a big agent that would be combining my Christian nationalist upbringing with having a narcissist mother, and it would be a memoir. Since I have one successful memoir, he was convinced he could sell another one. Mm-hmm. But the book didn't sell, and I found that out in November of last year, that we just weren't going to be able to sell this book. And I wasn't very excited about writing it. I didn't want to relive all my trauma in public, which you have to do to write a memoir that's effective.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I was kind of at loose ends, and I picked up Mandate for Leadership, Project 2025, and started reading it. And I was 4 or 5 pages in when I was like, this is a Bible verse that they buried into this treatise right here. And I even let my husband read it and was reading some of the things out loud and saying, this is all Christian nationalist Bible stuff. And he said, well, I never would have picked up on that. He was reared Catholic, very different from me. Mm-hmm. And so I started looking at how the mainstream media was talking about Project 2025. For example, The Atlantic devoted a whole magazine issue.
Right, I remember that.
Having different of their writers talking about Project 2025. And I read that and was like, this is just so wonkish and so academic that nobody's even going to read all the way through this. You know, nobody's talking about how this will ruin how this will ruin my life or how it will ruin your life, Stephen, if this gets enacted. And so I persevered and read the whole thing and decided that I could still use all of my knowledge about Christian nationalism to put a lens on this document and on what Republicans have been doing for decades to try to enact and enforce their will on everyone. Because, you know, the brand of evangelicalism that I grew up in was go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. You know, it was the evangelical Christianity, the Great Commission. In the 90s, after I started moving away from that, we had this rise of something called dominionism and the 7 Mountain Mandate,
right,
which really turned that Great Commission into go ye into all the world and force the gospel. Preacher.
Yeah.
And so that's what a lot of the Republicans that we have in government now, they kind of have that mindset. We don't need to persuade people anymore. We just need to force them to do the right thing.
How do you...
And Project 2025 is very much of that kind of thinking.
How do you square the notion that conservatives have always been, excuse me, they've always been very doctrinaire about the Constitution. They've always been read the Constitution literally. You know, all the Supreme Court justices that get interviewed for confirmation say that they don't want to overturn any constitutional laws, and yet the Christian nationalists, who are usually on the conservative side of the aisle, are totally willing to get rid of the separation of church and state right now. I mean, how do you read that?
In their minds, they're not, you know, they have their own interpretation of the Constitution that comes from this notion that America was founded as a Christian nation.
Yeah.
And all the founders meant for us to all be Christians because they were all Christians. And I don't believe this. This is what they believe. But because they put that lens on the Constitution, they have flipped James Madison, who was the final writer of separation of church and state. A bunch of people worked on it, but he's credited with the final language. You know, and he was very much the government can't force people to practice a certain religion or to think a certain way. You know, the government can't control our minds. But they look at some of his other activities and try to say that he meant that to protect the church from the state, not the other way around. I was always taught the separation of church and state was designed to protect the church from the state. That is how Christian nationalists teach people to view the Constitution. That's the lens that they use. So when Leonard Leo came up with the term originalism in the early 80s, because that's how old it is.
Yeah, that's right, under Reagan.
He used the same principles that I was taught to say the Bible is 100% inspired word of God. It is God's law. And you're taught all of these thought-terminating statements and cliches to push back against people who try to argue with you. So that's essentially what originalism is for the Constitution. You know, when you say, I don't agree with this aspect of the Bible, well, it's God's word. Yeah. Well, I still don't agree with it. And how do you know it's God's word? Because the Bible says it is. You know, those are those circular statements that you're taught. And you can't ask God who's right. And that's what they've done with originalism. Well, the Constitution says this. I think the founders meant this. Well, how do you know? Because it says, you know, because this says and that says and I believe and all these thought-terminating statements. And you can't dig up the founders and ask them what they meant.
Right. It's kind of the way they've manipulated the definition of the Second Amendment, you know, where they
right.
You know, they frame the interpretation of the Second Amendment to work with their worldview about whether or not people have a right to own guns, when that's not what the Second Amendment really was about. But right. Anyway, I just want to tell my audience and I can't go through all of them because, you know, you've written dozens of essays on Project 2025 since you've started this. But some of the topics,
it's probably 2 books by now, Steve.
Yeah, well, I'll be one of the first to buy it when it hits the bookstores or Amazon, as the case may be. But I want to list some of just a few of the topics you cover to give my listeners an idea of what you're talking about, the Christian nationalist overtones on policy. So you have Project 2025 promise to dismantle the administrative state and return self-governance to the American people, where we explore the 4 Christo-fascist promises and what they mean for you. There's another one, Project 2025, what is a family and what its definition could mean for welfare assistance, the Respect for Marriage Act, no-fault divorce, and more. Why Christian nationalists don't believe in climate change. Hint, it's also why Project 2025 guts climate language and funding. Project 2025, how section author Roger Severino is gunning for same-sex marriage. The Christo-fascist author of Project 2025's Health and Human Services section puts it all on the page. And the list goes on about, you know, how you very brilliantly lay out how Project 2025 is going to try to seep into every aspect of our lives. How do you when you write these, are you going through it chronologically through Project 2025? Or are you targeting certain issues that you want to talk about?
Some people approach it chronologically, but I think that's a mistake because it's so front-loaded with so much boring jargon on purpose that I really haven't covered a lot of that jargon yet. The intro is very inflammatory, and I've spent a lot of time there. But the first couple of sections are more policy-oriented, and there's not as much inflammatory stuff in it. It's really when you get to the middle, if you can persevere,
yeah,
that you start finding that. And so I decided to dive in. I typically, and I've kind of changed how I approach it now because, you know, I expected 100 people maybe to read this. I thought nobody would care. And so it's grown pretty significantly, and tons of people are subscribed to it now. So I periodically have to keep in mind that I have new people all the time, that I have to be helping understand how to dive into what's essentially 2 books worth of information that I've done and understand it, and then keep people who've been around for a long time learning new things as well. So I kind of have a bifurcated approach to how I write about it now, and have started focusing more on how Republicans in red states are already implementing Project 2025.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And how the Supreme Court is already implementing Project 2025. That states like Texas and Florida are already well on their way to living in the world Project 2025 envisions.
Yeah, do you feel...
And so that's...
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, do you feel like throughout the manifesto, there is a Christian nationalism hook to almost everything in there, or are you going to cover some topics in Project 2025 that really don't involve Christian nationalism?
Well, Project 2025 is funded by the Republican Party's billionaire overlords.
Right.
That's what I call them, you know. So they have their own objectives that they want to accomplish with this thing, which are, we never pay taxes again as the rich. We don't have to pay taxes. We don't want to pay taxes, and we don't want to have any regulation whatsoever on our ability to make money.
Yeah, they want to take us back to raw capitalism.
Right.
Yeah.
And so they have those objectives, and that's really more what you see when you look at the economic proposals and the climate proposals, you know, what they're going to do with the planet in Project 2025. It's not so Christian nationalism driven. It's more raw capitalism driven. But how the billionaire overlords know from history that they can control the rest of us is to pick some oppressive religion and force everybody to live under it. And so with the Republican Party, they found a really great partner who's salivating to oppress us all and force us to live under their interpretation of the Bible. So it's a marriage of two really awful groups of people.
Yeah, well, my definition of it, or what I've called it, is the unholy trinity of Christian nationalism, white supremacy, and right-wing American oligarchy, where the oligarchs, the would-be oligarchs, or actually the current oligarchs, are basically have co-opted the Christian nationalists and the white supremacists to kind of do their bidding. I mean, I don't think that a lot of billionaires in America are necessarily Christian nationalists or white supremacists, although I'm sure a number of them are the latter. But those groups are convenient allies in what they're trying to accomplish economically in this country.
Yeah, and ProPublica had a really good article several weeks ago about a group called Ziklag,
right?
Which is, you know, a bunch of these billionaire families who are Christian nationalists. They were, you know. So there is a subset of the billionaire oligarchy that is actually Christian nationalists, which I don't separate Christian nationalists from white supremacists. I think Christian nationalists are white supremacists.
Yeah. And I think it's important to look at it that way, because how else are we going to fight this thing if we don't understand what the definition is? And you know, if you start separating out the agendas, you can lose track of what's really going on here. And as much as the mainstream media, well, MSNBC talks about it a little bit. You know, there are certain shows that have segments on Project 2025. I don't think they've scratched the surface yet on how draconian this is, the way you were doing it.
Well, it takes a lot of dedication and time, you know, and I have, you know, over 10,000 subscribers, and you have various degrees of investment. Some people show up every day and are probably as much of an expert on Project 2025 as I am by now.
Right.
But then you have people who dip in every couple of weeks and read something and learn a little something. So, you know, not everybody is as dedicated to understanding it.
Yeah.
And that's the same thing in the media. I mean, there's just not that much interest in understanding all of it.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask you, as an editor and a writer myself, I want to sort of ask you a little question along from that perspective. So now that you've got all these subscribers, do you feel under pressure to continue to create content, or and if you do you have a system on? Have you said to yourself, well, now that I have this readership, I need to produce X number of essays a week, or I can't go too long without adding more content? How are you approaching that structurally?
Well, Project 2025 is the structure, or it has been the structure. Now the structure is more, here's 3 laws that were passed this week in different states or proposed that are from Project 2025. So let's talk about those this week.
Right.
But the outline of what's in there dictates what I'm writing. And I write 5 newsletters a week. I could really write double or triple that.
Wow.
But I don't think people would read them.
Right.
You know, once we get past the election and Kamala Harris wins, as you said, you know, who knows what will become of this work. Project 2025 will not go away. This is their moonshot.
Mm-hmm.
This is everything they've worked for close to 50 years, put down on paper.
Yeah, I'm glad.
And they're not going to give up on it just because they lose the election.
Yeah, have you thought about different scenarios in your mind about what their next moves might be when Kamala becomes president? When, you know, I thought when Barack Obama won the presidency twice, which was way before I thought I would see a black man elected president. I think it was a lot of people were amazed that this happened when it did, and not only once but twice. And my reaction to that was, you know, I remember saying to friends, you know, boy, I'm so relieved now that, you know, the country has gotten so advanced that we elected a black man twice, and those right-wing white supremacists, racists are now really put in a corner, and they're done for good. And boy, was I wrong about that. I had,
and that was how many Americans on the left reacted to that.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a really good book that you should pick up and read. It's from several years ago. It's a former Google executive, and he wrote this book called Everybody Lies.
Mm-hmm.
They tell the truth to Google, but they'll lie to you about the same thing. And so he dug into all these Google searches and found that in the 24 hours after Barack Obama was elected the first time, Google searches for how to kill an N-word, how to join the KKK, how to lynch an N-word, etc., jumped by some exponent on the internet. So while people on the left were thinking, we've finally gotten the country to where we want it to be and we can relax, our fight was really just beginning then.
Mm-hmm.
But we did not approach it that way. And we had no idea this was happening online. And people are all floored by all this racism that was always there, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So we had not vanquished any of that. What we did really was just terrify these people into forming the Tea Party movement, into electing Donald Trump, into supporting autocratic governments over democracy so that they could ensure their power structure continued. So when I speak to groups of Democrats, and I'll say this to your group when I speak to them in a couple of weeks,
mm-hmm.
electing Kamala Harris, the start of our fight.
Oh, absolutely.
Save our democracy. It is not we've elected a black woman, a biracial woman. We can say we vanquished this. No, it is the very beginning of our fight to save our democracy.
Well,
because we still have so much work to do.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, if they were ready to go off the edge of a cliff when Barack Obama was elected twice, the idea that Hillary Clinton might have succeeded him totally drove them crazy. I can't imagine what they're going to be thinking in those closed door rooms if a black woman is in the White House after they just had Donald Trump. And I know you remember this. I don't remember if it was after the first Obama election or the second. It might have been after the second one, when they talked this big game about doing an autopsy of the Republican Party. And I remember Rance Priebus, who was running the RNC, talking about, well, we're going to figure out a way to bring minorities into the party. We're going to figure out a way to talk to them. And that went out the window almost immediately. And I think, Donald Trump emerged from the Republican Party and the right wing of the Republican Party, looking at the losses by John McCain and Mitt Romney and saying, we got to get rid of this wing of the party. We can't have these run-of-the-mill conservative Republicans, running for presidential elections anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so what do you think? What keeps you up at night, even if Kamala Harris wins the election, about what they might do after that?
There are several things that do. Number one, Democrats don't have a great track record of reading the room.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think a lot of Democrats still grasp the weight and the import of the era we're living through, and the amount of bravery and so forth that needs to be embraced to do what needs to be done to shore up our democracy, to make changes to our democracy for a 21st century multicultural democracy to be possible, because our founders did not care about that. I mean, many of them were slaveholders, so they didn't even view black people as human beings.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that is baked into our Constitution because of that. So we have a lot of work to do to make our democracy functional as a 21st century multicultural democracy. And I'm not sure a lot of Democrats, especially Democratic leaders, especially older school ones,
mm-hmm.
have what it takes to do that.
And
also,
yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, what I think you're getting at here, if I can put some meat on those bones, is, let's do a little hypothetical. Kamala Harris wins the presidency, and because of all this momentum right now, the Democrats are able to get the House and the Senate back. Best case scenario. Do you think that they're going to use those wins and that power to do things like expand the Supreme Court or impose the term limits on the Supreme Court, start talking about getting rid of the Electoral College, all the things that the minority in this country is using to try to get power? Do you think they'll be bold and gutsy enough to make those moves?
I hope so, but I'm not sure. That it's so difficult to just trash the filibuster in the Senate.
Right.
And that there are several Democrats who would cling to that. And I understand why, but also that rule is just so bad for majority government,
mm-hmm.
and gives these minority states so much power over the rest of us. So, I don't know if they'll have the chutzpah or the necessary will and ambition and drive and to do those things. I hope they will. I hope we can give them enough of a mandate to understand that we don't want to live in the world that Republicans have set out for us. On the flip side, I could see a state like Texas, I could see Greg Abbott just saying we're seceding.
Mm-hmm.
I could see something like that happening in a state like that, because there's a whole undercurrent of people there who believe that Texas isn't part of the United States anyway and never has been. I've spent a lot of time there talking about my books and have been lectured about that so many times by middle-aged white men. So there's a lot of people there who believe things like that. So that something like that could happen isn't unheard of or ridiculous or hyperbolic to think about. But on the Christian nationalist side, I think they will pivot again. You know, they pivoted from we're openly evangelical and we live our Christian life and we try to convert you to we're going to just force you to live the way we say, and we're living our Christian life as an example of that. And I think they'll pivot again more to very secret societies where they have this end goal of creating their Christian nationalist theocracy, but they never talk about it, and we don't know who's in it. And dominionism has aspects of that.
Right.
But the people still live as openly Christian. So I think they'll make it even harder to discern who is one of them.
Yeah,
as a means of
since the anti-abortion movement is such a huge part of the underpinning of Christian nationalism, at least, and you can correct me if I'm wrong about that. Should the Democrats be able to enshrine Roe v. Wade as the law of the land, which is going to take a major policy point off the table for the right wing, although I'm sure they will do whatever they can to try to keep it going. I don't, if it's the law of the land, they can't do it state by state anymore. What effect do you think that would have on that whole Christian nationalist movement if they lose that as their main issue?
Well, I don't think a lot of people on the left understand how radicalized so many of the people in the Christian nationalist movement are. I don't even like the term Christian nationalism. I call them radicalized Christians. Because, they are, and on abortion especially, I mean, these people, some of them are willing to die to protect these precious unborn babies that they, and that they have been indoctrinated with so much violent imagery and so much false science around what happens during a woman's pregnancy and gestation and abortion procedures that I certainly think we will have violence around the country over something like that happening. I mean, I said on my Substack, I was in elementary school and my pastor would say from the pulpit, someday you might have to take up arms and kill your fellow Americans for Jesus, for your right to worship. So, you think about the people who've sat in those same pews for 50 years and listened to that and have not taken any kind of off-ramp that they've been offered, and how radicalized many of those people are. Right. They have to be.
Yeah.
When Pew and other research groups do research and publish that X percent of Americans, 20-something percent of Americans think that killing other Americans to save the country would be a worthwhile thing to do. A lot of those people are in that group, that Christian nationalist group.
Yeah. One of my biggest hobby horse, ever since Trump got elected, even before that, has been the whole issue of voting rights in this country. I'm very passionate about the notion that everybody in this country should have the right to vote. Voter suppression tactics drive me crazy. It's one of the things that I just can't wrap my head around is the right wing and the Republican Party constantly talking about voter fraud, which doesn't exist, when the real fraud is the voter suppression and voter nullification movements that they're able to get away with apparently legally in a lot of states. So what you're reading, and of course, remember Trump got in front of that Christian group and said, you won't have to vote anymore if you elect me. What's Project 20? You're reading of Project 2025 when it comes to voting rights.
They don't really address voting rights. They put some of their more fringe ideas out on their far-right websites and whatever, taking away a woman's right to vote and going to a household vote, for example, which is something that's been bandied about in Texas already.
Is that like when J.D. Vance said that you should be able to vote, have as many votes as you have children?
Well, he said that people who don't have children shouldn't be able to vote because they don't have any investment in the future of this country.
Right.
So, and I think I represented him correctly in saying that.
I think
but there are a host of people on the far right who don't believe women should be able to vote, and we should repeal the 19th Amendment.
Unbelievable.
And so, but those kinds of things aren't spelled out in Project 2025.
You think they deliberately tried to keep that in the shadows because it would be too inflammatory for people to understand?
One of the things that I constantly point out on my Substack is how over the course of 50 years, they have understood that they can't talk to voters the way they talk amongst themselves. So you sent me the hidden recording of Russ Vogt talking to these British journalists who were undercover.
Right.
And that's a really good example of what I mean. He talked like they talk amongst themselves in that video. And so you heard all kinds of like really whacked out crazy stuff coming out of his mouth. But this is what they believe is normal. This is how they talk amongst themselves. But they understand that the voters aren't going to vote for that. So they've come up with this whole other language to talk to voters, to take those ideas and repackage them as something that's palatable to voters. And that's a lot of what I spend my time doing on my Substack, is explaining when they say guns don't kill people, people kill people, or thoughts and prayers after a shooting, what they're really saying, it sounds empathetic, even though it started to drive a lot of people crazy. But at the beginning, it sounded empathetic. But what they're really saying is God is judging America because we have rejected him. And so we have to live with things like mass shootings because of all this sin that God is judging us for. And if America would just turn back to God, then we wouldn't have these shootings because nobody would want to shoot people anymore. And so we're going to have to continue to live with this kind of judgment until America turns back to God. That's really what they're saying when they say thoughts and prayers or guns don't kill people, people kill people.
Yeah. Well, we just, in the few minutes we have left, what I definitely want to get in an announcement about your appearance through the Democrats of the Red Rocks event. So I want to tell you all that this event that the Democrats of the Red Rocks is going to have on August 29th at 5 p.m. on Zoom, my guest today, Andra Watkins, will discuss the many ways that Project 2025 would affect our day-to-day existence if, God forbid, Donald Trump is elected. She'll be talking about everything from the treatment of women to abolition of the Environmental Protection Agency to pushing a Christian agenda on citizens in exchange for public benefits. So for more information on how you can attend this Zoom on August 29th, go to the Democrats of the Red Rocks website at democratsoftheredrocks.org. Well, my friends, that's it for today's episode of the Patriotic Progressive on KAZM Mellow Mountain Radio. Andra, I can't thank you enough for being on the show today. Your Substack is fantastic. Everybody should read it. And I'm looking forward to seeing you at that door event on the 29th.
Thanks for having me, Stephen. I've enjoyed being here.
Great. Thank you. We'll be in touch. So,
okay.
All right. Many thanks to my producer in the booth, Ryan Thompson. Please tune in again next Saturday morning from 8 to 9 a.m. when I'll be talking again about the latest in the 2024 presidential race and the upcoming Democratic Convention in Chicago. And remember, you can live stream our show on mellowmountainradio.com and hear the podcast version on Apple, YouTube, Spotify, and Amazon Music. And at 10 a.m. this morning, please tune in to Sedona Life with Stephen Hanks, when the subject will be Friends Protecting Our Local Environment, and my special in-studio guests will be leaders from the groups Friends of the Forest and Friends of the Verde River. Thanks for listening to the Patriotic Progressive, for truth, justice, and the democratic way. Have a great week, everyone.